You are now listening to the story, Banished for Birthing a Girl. She collapsed in the snow, but a lonely man saw her. A tale of heartbreak, survival, and the quiet courage that blooms in the coldest of places. The wind howled across the prairie like a wounded animal, tearing at the wooden walls of Thomas's cabin and shrieking through the trees like something ancient and angry. The land outside was nothing but a sea of white winter that refused to let up. Inside, the fire hissed and cracked, but the warmth it offered couldn't thaw the man sitting quietly in the corner. Thomas sat still, a figure carved from solitude. His hands were roughened by years of hard labor, and his face bore the weathered lines of wind, sun, and sorrow. It had been 3 years since the fever took his wife and 2 young sons. Since then, he had retreated into this small patch of the world, surrounded by snow, silence, and ghosts. Each day passed like the last. Chop wood, feed the cattle, patch fences, sit by the fire. Try not to remember. That afternoon, as he split logs by the woodpile, a movement caught his eye. Not an animal, not wind, something else. A dark shape, far off at the edge of his land, nearly lost in the swirl of snow. He stopped mid-swing, gripping the axe tightly. Out here, no one came uninvited. Not in weather like this. Caution urged him to ignore it. But curiosity pushed him forward. He fetched his coat and rifle, stuffing a few strips of jerky into his satchel. Rusty, his loyal old hound, whined at the door, sensing the shift. "Stay, boy," Thomas murmured. Stepping out into the storm, each step toward the shape felt like a decision. Snow clung to his boots, pulled at his coat. The figure became clearer to still, too small, a person, face down. And then he saw the second shape, a smaller bundle, clutched tightly beneath the body. He dropped to his knees, heart pounding. Woman, native, young, barely breathing. Her skin was pale, hair frozen in braids. She held something close, a child, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, tiny and still. Thomas felt panic, sharp and unfamiliar. He hadn't seen another soul in weeks. He hadn't touched another human being since his wife died. And now, here was a mother and child, inches from death, collapsed in the snow-covered field. The easy thing would be to walk away. He almost did, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she clutched the baby, even in unconsciousness. Coney, maybe it was the memory of his own children. Maybe it was that tiny, shuddering breath the baby took barely there, but enough. He gritted his teeth, hoisted the woman over his shoulder with difficulty, and cradled the child in one arm. The snow resisted every step back to the cabin. Cold tore at him. Cold seeped through his coat. The weight on his back was heavy, but not as heavy as what was stirring in his chest. By the time he reached the cabin, his legs were shaking. He laid the woman by the fire, carefully freeing the baby from her arms. The child was alive, a girl. Her cheeks were nearly white, lips tinged with blue, but she whimpered a thin sound that hit Thomas harder than any storm. He worked quickly, wrapping them both in dry blankets, building the fire higher, boiling water, making a weak broth. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew how to fight cold. The woman didn't wake that night. The baby stirred often, mewling softly. Thomas, unsure what to do, gave her drops of warm water from his fingertip. She took it, weakly. It was something. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, watching them. 2 strangers. A woman and her child. Intruders, maybe, but also survivors. Just like him, he didn't know who they were. Didn't know where they came from. But he knew one thing. They were under his roof now. Morning came slowly to the cabin, the gray light outside nearly indistinguishable from the gloom within. The fire had burned low overnight, but Thomas had kept it alive. dozed in the rocking chair, rifle leaning nearby, eyes flicking open. Every time the baby made a sound, the woman still hadn't woken. He checked her breathing, shallow but steady. She was warm now, her skin no longer ice pale. Her damp clothes lay in a pile by the fire, replaced with his spare shirt and blankets. The baby he hadn't dared name her in his mind was wrapped in wool and sleeping fitfully. Thomas wasn't sure what he expected. Gratitude? Accusation? He didn't know what she'd say when she woke, or if she'd even speak his language, but she finally did, stirred towards the evening of the second day. Faint groaned. Her hand twitched. He was across the room, cleaning his rifle, when her eyes snapped open, dark and sharp, despite her weakness. Kay? Panic flooded her face as she saw him. She sat up fast, disoriented, clutching for the baby. Her fingers found the bundle beside her and she pulled it close, arms trembling but determined. Easy, Thomas said quickly, voice low and rough from disuse. He raised his hand slightly, showing her he meant no harm. Then he gestured to the fire. Warm, safe. She said nothing. Her body remained taut, her gaze darting between him and the door. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, she glanced down at the baby, and her shoulders loosened just a bit. Thomas reached for the bowl of broth he'd kept warm and approached slowly. He placed it on the floor near her and stepped back. She didn't touch it, not immediately. She looked at him, eyes hard with suspicion, but also with hunger. Only after a long pause did she reach forward, her fingers shaking, and lift the bowl to her lips. She sipped, slowly. When the bowl was empty, she held it tightly in both hands, as if it might disappear. He didn't speak, didn't press her. That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did he. By the third morning, they had established an uneasy rhythm. He worked, tending the fire, chopping wood, boiling water while she cared for the baby. He noticed how carefully she handled the child. Every motion was protective, reverent. He'd seen that kind of fierce devotion before long ago, in his wife's arms. Still, she didn't speak much, but her eyes watched everything. And when she finally murmured her name, Nahili, came like the crack of a thawing river. Gentle, uncertain, but real. The baby's name followed soon after. Ayanna. Thomas repeated both names under his breath when she wasn't listening. Something about them warmed the corners of the cabin. Names meant roots, belonging, and he hadn't said any in so long. He tried not to remember his own children's names. One afternoon, while tending the fire, Thomas noticed Nahili staring out the window. Her eyes weren't just sad, they were haunted. She flinched when Rusty barked at a snow hare. She tensed whenever he stepped too close. Later that evening, she motioned to her stomach, then to Ayanna. Her face darkened. Girl, she said, almost spitting the word. Not boy. Try banish. The weight of it landed like a stone. Thomas had heard whispers of such things, even in the settlements. Some tribal traditions, twisted by years of conflict and outside influence, had come to view daughters as less than sons. In a time of scarcity, a girl could be seen as a burden, but to cast a mother and child out into a blizzard. He looked at Ayanna, nestled beside her mother, small, so innocent. Nahili's eyes filled with something Thomas recognized: shame, fear, and a flicker of something else. Hope. Safe here, he said, touching his chest. Then he gestured to the cabin, to the warmth. Safe. She met his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Once it was the beginning of something fragile in the coming days. Thomas brought small things for Ayanna from town: a soft scrap of fabric, smooth stone, a wooden bird he found forgotten on a shelf. Nahili watched him with cautious eyes, but something softened in her stare. She even offered him words from her language, simple things, spoken gently. He stumbled through them, but she smiled once when he got one nearly right. He didn't talk much about his past, but Nahili didn't need to ask. She saw it in the way he touched the baby's cradle as he walked past, in the way his eyes lingered on the rocking chair by the fire when no one else sat, in the way he sometimes stood at the door, staring into the snow, not seeing anything at all, and she understood. Her own silence carried grief too. They were two people who had lost everything, but now there was Ayanna, and because of her, maybe something new could begin. Spring was still months away, but inside the cabin, something was beginning to thaw. Ayanna was no longer silent. Her coos and giggles now filled the quiet corners of the home, bouncing off the wooden walls like sunlight where there used to be only shadow. Thomas, who once measured days by chores and silence, found himself whittling small toys, a carved rabbit, Kay, a bird with wings that didn't flap but made her laugh anyway. He wasn't sure when he started smiling again. Nahili had also changed. Her movements were less guarded. The deep tension in her shoulders had eased. She still watched the windows warily, still kept a bundle of herbs tucked beside the fire. But when she moved through the cabin, she no longer moved like a stranger. There was no need for many words. A nod from her now meant, "Thank you." A glance meant, "Watch the baby." A brief touch of her fingers on his arm when passing by meant something Thomas couldn't name, but he understood it all the same. They ate in quiet most nights, sometimes with Ayanna cradled between them, sometimes with her sleeping in the corner, cheeks rosy from warmth. Once, Thomas looked up and found Nahili watching him, not with fear or suspicion, but something closer to gratitude, maybe recognition. Still, outside their walls, the world hadn't changed. On his monthly trip to the settlement for supplies, Thomas noticed a shift immediately. The general store was buzzing with the low tones of suspicion, fear, and ignorance. A group of men hunched near the stove, Brody among them. Brody was trouble, always had been. Big voice, bigger ego. It's the kind of man who thought respect came from intimidation. Thomas had never liked him, and the feeling was mutual. "Did y'all hear about that squaw?" Brody sneered, spitting into the fire. "They say she's cursed. Birthed a girl. Tribe tossed her like spoiled meat, wandering these hills like a ghost." Someone muttered something about bad luck. Another mentioned livestock gone missing, blaming it on dark medicine. Thomas kept his face still, heart pounding. They were talking about Nahili. He was sure of it. He paid for his supplies in silence, gripping the sack so hard his knuckles turned white. No one asked where he'd been keeping himself. He knew they wondered. Eyes followed him out the door. The ride back to the cabin was long and cold, but his mind burned with something fierce and hot. Fear, yes, but also anger. A righteous kind. The kind that grows when you realize kindness might soon come at a cost. When he arrived home, Nahili was at the door before he even dismounted. She could tell something in his face, his shoulders. "They talk," she said quietly. He hesitated, then nodded. "They talk," she repeated. "Maybe, ... leave." "No," Thomas said firmly. "Not now, not ever." But Nahili looked away, her eyes misted with dread. She was no fool. She had lived long enough under white men's judgment to know what was coming. Later that night, when Ayanna had fallen asleep, she surprised him with a single, whispered word in English. "Go." Thomas turned to her, stunned. "What? You go? Safe? Me and a Yana ... Go." His throat tightened. He stood and walked away, unable to respond. The idea of losing them after they had become so much a part of his every hour was unbearable. And yet, she was trying to protect him. He couldn't allow that. Not again. He had already lost a family once. He wasn't going to lose another. The warning came days later, not as a threat, but as a message unspoken. 3 riders on the horizon. Watching, Thomas stood on his porch, rifle in hand. Nahili stood just behind the door, Ayana quiet in her arms. Damn, the riders didn't approach that day, but they returned the next, and again the day after that. Then, finally, they came close. Brody led the group, flanked by 2 others from the settlement men, who had always followed rather than thought for themselves. Their horses were tired, but the hatred in their eyes was fresh. "This your idea of charity now, Thomas?" Brody called out, not dismounting. "Harboring savages." Thomas didn't answer at first. He didn't move. "Come on, man. She don't belong out here. Heard what she done? Banished? Cursed? That baby's probably not even stop," Thomas said, his voice low. Brody laughed. "You think you're better than the rest of us, out here playing family?" Thomas raised his rifle, slightly nighed, pointed, but not lowered either. "They're under my roof. That means they're mine to protect." Brody's smile disappeared. "Careful, Thomas. Town's not going to forget this. They can remember all they like." The standoff stretched. Finally, Brody spat into the snow and turned his horse, saying over. They rode off without a fight, but not without a warning. Nahili stood in the doorway long after they were gone. Thomas joined her. No words were exchanged. None were needed. What mattered was already clear. They were no longer just coexisting. They were surviving together, and together they'd face whatever storm came next. Snow fell again that night, soft and silent, blanketing the land in white, as if trying to erase the tension etched into the soil. Inside the cabin, Thomas sat by the fire with Ayana sleeping in his lap. Healy moved quietly, preparing a pot of broth. Neither of them spoke about the men who had come, or their silence was no longer the kind that separated was shared. It's protective, purposeful. Thomas glanced at the door every few minutes, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. Yet, he had lived through blizzards, illness, and starvation. But this was a new kind of storm, one built not from nature's cruelty, prejudice-filled, prejudice-fed, and coming straight for their home. Nahili felt it too. He saw it in the way she wrapped Ayana more tightly at night, or the way she stirred at every creak of the wood floor. Still, she didn't ask to leave again. She was done running, and so was he. The days that followed passed intense, watchful quiet. Thomas fixed the broken latch on the door. He cut more firewood than usual. He cleaned the rifle twice a day. Healy taught Ayana to stand by, holding onto the edge of a bench. The baby's laughter light, bubbling, alive, clashed beautifully against the dread coiling outside the walls. When Thomas returned from town the next week, the mood was worse than before. People didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. Their stares were sharp enough. He caught whispers. Brody was stirring things up. Talk of justice, of making things right. Back at the cabin, Thomas brought Nahili a bundle of soft cloth he'd traded for something for Ayana's growing feet. Nahili accepted it with a small smile that faded too quickly. That night, while Ayana slept between them on the floor, Nahili finally told him the full story. Her people had changed. Kia and scarcity had twisted tradition. Her husband, desperate for a son, had turned cold when Ayana was born. Others followed. A girl brings nothing, they said. A mouth to feed, not a spear to hunt. So they cast her out in the middle of winter. No food, no horse, just shame and a newborn baby wrapped in her last blanket. I walked, she said simply, eyes staring into the fire. 3 days, maybe 4. Thomas didn't interrupt. Her voice was quiet, but steady like a river that had cut through. Stoned for miles, I prayed to die, but she, she cried, so I walked. Thomas swallowed hard. The fire crackled between them, its light dancing in her dark eyes. She saved me, she whispered. Even if they don't want her, she's Mine. Thomas looked at Ayanna, her tiny chest rising and falling in sleep. She's yours, he said, and she's staying. Nahili met his gaze. This time, there was no hesitation. 2 days later, the riders came again. Not 3, this time 4. Brody in the lead. Their horses kicked up snow as they circled the cabin, not bothering to hide their intent. Thomas was already waiting on the porch, his rifle resting against his shoulder. You had your warning, Brody barked, eyes full of arrogance. This is your last chance. No, Thomas said. Brody laughed. You really gonna die for her? I already did, Thomas replied, surprising even himself. What? I died 3 winters ago, when I buried my boys, when I buried my wife. What's left of me isn't afraid of men like you. Brody's sneer wavered. Thomas took 1 step forward. I'll tell you what I am afraid of. I'm afraid of waking up tomorrow, knowing I didn't protect what matters, that I let fear win, that I stood aside like the rest of you, while a mother and her baby froze in the snow. Silence. Even Brody's men shifted uncomfortably. Get off my land, Thomas said. Brody's hand hovered near his gun. Thomas raised his rifle slightly calm. Sure, ready. And for a moment, just a moment, the world held its breath. Then Brody backed down. This ain't over, he spat, turning his horse. Town ain't gonna forget. Then let them remember, Thomas replied. The men turned and rode off, snow swirling in their wake. Inside the cabin, Nahili hadn't moved. She had watched everything through the crack in the door. When Thomas stepped inside, she met him there, for the first time. She touched his hand, not in fear or thanks, but something deeper. Her grip was warm, grounding. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Outside, the wind howled. But inside, for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel cold. He felt something else. He felt home. Winter didn't end overnight. The snow still lingered in patches across the prairie, and the wind still carried its sharp, whistling bite through the trees. But something had changed. Inside the cabin, warmth had taken root not just from the fire, but from presence, purpose, and the small joy of 3 people bound not by blood, but by choice. Ayanna had begun to crawl. Her tiny hands found everything, the cold corners under the furniture, the grooves in the floorboards, the edges of Thomas's boots. Every discovery was a triumph, every giggle a miracle. The cabin that had once echoed with silence now rang with life, laughter, movement, soft voices. Thomas carved her a toy little horse with smooth wooden wheels. We placed it on the floor before her. She slapped it happily and looked up at him as if he'd just brought down the moon. He wasn't sure what fatherhood was supposed to feel like after loss, but watching her grow, seeing the light return to Nahili's eyes, filled a place in him he'd believed was permanently hollow. Some evenings, he and Nahili would sit on the front step after Ayanna had gone to sleep. She'd lean against him lightly, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her gaze cast toward the dark horizon. Do you think they'll come back? She asked one night, barely above a whisper. Yes, he said. Someday. Nahili nodded, as if she'd already made peace with it. Then we wait. They did more than wait. I lived. Thomas rebuilt the fencing along the northern edge of the property with Nahili's help. She taught him how to brew tea from dried herbs she gathered near the creek. In return, he showed her how to ride the old horse gently so Ayanna could sit in her lap. She laughed freely now, not often. But when she did, it was no longer tinged with fear, and Thomas found himself speaking more. Not just about the weather or chores, but about his wife and his boys, Samuel and Eli. He spoke of them, not with crushing grief anymore, but with reverence, as if they'd cleared a path for this unlikely second chance. One day, Thomas returned from the settlement with supplies, had something else, tension, "They're still talking," he said simply, setting down the sacks. Nahili didn't ask who. She didn't need to. They both knew. "Ayana's growing," she said, eyes following the baby as she toddled toward the fire, one hand outstretched. Thomas nodded. "Let them talk. We're not hiding." He hadn't expected the words to come so easily, but they felt right. Let them talk. Let them whisper and point and pass judgment from the warmth of their own homes. He had nothing to hide. Tate, not anymore. That spring, green returned to the land, slowly at first amid blades of grass, scattered wildflowers blooming defiantly through the melting snow. Trees budded, the creek ran faster, and the air no longer smelled like ice, but like earth. Ayana took her first step outside on that soft soil, her feet wobbling as Nahili held her hands steady. Thomas watched from the porch, arms crossed, smiling despite himself. This child, who had nearly died in a snowdrift, now stumbled through wildflowers. Her giggles echoed across the prairie. There was no curse in her, only life, a new beginning. One night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas finally said what had been building in his heart. "I don't know what this is, what we are, but I know. I'd rather face another winter with you and Ayana than spend another summer alone." Nahili looked up at him, her face still and unreadable. Then she nodded. "This is home," she said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a vow. It was something more powerful. Acceptance. In the months that followed, the threats quieted. Brody and his kind hadn't returned. Not yet, anyway. Maybe they knew Thomas wouldn't back down. Maybe they simply turned their hatred elsewhere. Oh, maybe, just maybe, some small part of the town remembered the man Thomas used to be and respected, who he had chosen to become. And if they didn't, let them come. This cabin, once a place of mourning, now stood as a place of quiet defiance. Not against violence, but against despair. Thomas often thought about the day he found them, the black shape in the snow. The choice that had changed everything. He hadn't been looking for redemption. He hadn't believed he deserved it. But life had given it to him anyway, wrapped in a blanket, carried on a storm. And now, when the prairie wind rose and howled through the trees, it no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like music.